Have you ever watched Gladiator? Imagine being in that movie, not as a spectator in the audience, but as a regular citizen living in ancient Rome. What would your life be like? Would you have seen the Colosseum while strolling through the city or bought a slave from the merchant stalls? Hello, everyone. Welcome to my channel. Today we will look at how people bought and sold slaves in ancient Rome. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss out on any new videos. Picture yourself walking through the bustling Roman forum. Merchants shout, animals bleat, and in the middle of all this chaos stands the slave market. To the Romans, it wasn't unusual. It was just business. Slaves were lined up in rows, sometimes naked, with small signs hung around their necks listing their age, skills, and origins. Buyers browsed as though they were shopping for cattle. A strong young man who could work in the fields might fetch a different price than a Greek tutor fluent in philosophy. The value of a slave depended on appearance, skills, and even their birthplace. It sounds harsh, but in Rome this was everyday life. Now let's imagine you are a new slave owner. You want to put your new purchase to work immediately, but wait, you don't have a clue how to manage a slave. Don't worry, we got you covered. Let's see how your slave might have been priced. If you bought a slave in the 1st century AD during the Pax Romana or Roman peace, when the empire was at its peak, you'd likely pay anywhere from 200 to 400 sesterces. 1 sesterce was equal to 4 denarii, which were silver coins used throughout much of the Roman world. However, keep in mind that prices could change depending on the slave's age, health, gender, and abilities. A young slave, especially one who had been well cared for, would generally fetch a higher price than an older one since they had more years of working life left in them. Strength and stamina were valued, so slaves who looked healthy and fit commanded a higher price because they could work harder and longer. Gender also played a role. In general, female slaves were worth more than male slaves because they could be used for domestic tasks and, well, other reasons. And don't forget about those with special skills. Slaves who could read, write, or perform skilled labor were in high demand and therefore more expensive. If you were looking for a personal secretary or a craftsman, you'd have to shell out more money. But if you were willing to take on a slave who could do physical labor, you might be able to find someone for a bit cheaper. Oh, and did we mention where a slave was born also affected their price tag? Slaves from Greece and other Mediterranean regions often fetched higher prices because they were considered more civilized and educated. On the other hand, slaves from distant lands like Egypt or Africa might have been perceived as exotic and therefore more valuable. So the birth location of the slave could also affect their price. The most expensive slaves were those captured by armies during battles. These slaves were often sold in military auctions where the spoils of war were distributed. Since they hadn't been worked to death yet, these slaves were usually strong and healthy, making them worth the investment for a Roman buyer. The price of such a slave could reach up to 1,000 sesterces, 5 times the average price. This high cost was not only due to their vigor, but also because owning a former enemy soldier was a status symbol among the Romans. It showed that the owner had gained victory over that very soldier, which made them seem powerful and successful. Managing your newly acquired property could be tricky, but don't worry, there were professional slave managers. They oversaw every aspect of the slave's life, from their diet to their workload. And if you needed to transport your slave, no problem. Slave porters were available for hire. These guys knew how to move heavy loads, including your valuable new slave. They would carefully watch over your investment during transit, ensuring they arrived at their destination safe and sound. And remember, taking care of your slaves paid off. Healthy slaves worked better and for longer. So even though it might sound cruel, investing in your slave's well-being was good for business. In conclusion, buying a slave in ancient Rome was much like purchasing an investment today. Their price depended on many factors, from their age and health to their skills and birthplace. While the practice seems cruel to us today, it was commonplace in Roman society. And just like any investment, slave owners took great care of their property to ensure they got the best return on their investment. We hope you enjoyed learning about how people bought and sold slaves in ancient Rome. Do forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel to stay updated on all things history. Thanks for watching. Ancient Rome is full of extremes. Skyscrapers made of concrete, sprawling roads, huge public works projects, luxurious villas and vast estates owned by the elite class, but also extreme poverty, rampant inequality, and brutal working and living conditions for those at the bottom. In this light, it's no surprise that the institution of slavery in ancient Rome has fascinated people for centuries. What's life like for those in chains? What's life like for those who are free? And what's the connection between the two? One key element of Roman society that helps us understand this dynamic is the cost of slaves. After all, chattel slavery was a multi-billion-dollar industry. So how much did an enslaved person actually cost? Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we're talking about the price of slaves in ancient Rome. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe. We explore the history of money and finance in all its many guises. Ancient, medieval, modern, you name it. The price of slaves in ancient Rome varied wildly. A recently enslaved farm laborer from a conquered province might cost as little as 500 denarii, roughly the wages of a Roman soldier for a few months. On the other end of the spectrum, a beautiful concubine or a talented scribe could cost thousands of denarii, which were bronze coins used in ancient Rome, or a luxury slave, the prized possession of the Roman elite, could cost the equivalent of millions of dollars. Beautiful houses in Rome itself might cost around 40,000 denarii, meaning that in some cases a slave could cost more than a house. Many of the prices we know come from ads placed by people looking to sell their slaves. These ads would appear in public places throughout the Roman world. From Greece to Spain and France to Egypt, slave markets were not exclusive to Rome, though the city had the largest population of slaves and the greatest demand for them. So most of our examples come from there. A common price for a slave in Rome was around 1,000 denarii. This was about the average price for a healthy adult who could work in construction or as a domestic servant. It would have been cheap enough for a small farmer to purchase a few slaves to work his land, or a working-class family to have someone to help with household tasks so that a mother didn't have to stay home and do everything herself. It's important to note that while some scholars argue about the exact value of Roman coins throughout history, when it comes to slavery, we're not really dealing with abstract monetary values. We're talking about human beings, people who were bought and sold as property, ripped away from their homes and families and forced into servitude. Many of these individuals were also denied basic human rights and subjected to brutal punishments if they tried to escape. So when we talk about the price of slaves, we should remember that they were not commodities. They were people, and of course, different people had different values. Enslaved people were not only bought and sold, they were also freed, manumission, as it was called in Latin. Some former slaves were freed with generous severance packages, including money, housing, and even chariots. At the high end of the spectrum, we see wealthy Romans purchasing luxury slaves. People who were prized for their beauty, their skills, or their pedigree. These individuals were often the targets of slave traders who sought to profit from the inflated prices that the rich were willing to pay. A beautiful woman, for example, might be stolen from her village in Greece, brought to Rome and sold for a fortune. A skilled Greek tutor, meanwhile, might be lured to Rome with promises of fame and fortune, only to find himself chained up and put to work. One Roman emperor, Nero, infamously hosted a slave auction that featured over 200 former senators and knights. The price of slaves in ancient Rome was therefore not a static figure, but rather a fluctuating one that depended on a variety of factors, including the age, sex, race, health, skills, and pedigree of the individual. For many Romans, owning slaves was a sign of wealth and power. The more slaves a person owned, the wealthier he or she appeared to be. This was especially true for the emperors, who famously kept harems of both male and female slaves. So what does this all mean for understanding ancient Rome? When we think about the economy of ancient Rome, we tend to focus on the big things, the huge public works projects, the vast trade network. But slavery was also an important part of the economy, and the price of slaves was an important indicator of wealth and power. The price of slaves in ancient Rome was not a simple matter. It varied wildly depending on a number of factors. But one thing is for sure, the slave trade was a brutal and inhumane practice that caused immeasurable suffering. Not all slaves were equal in Roman society. There were field slaves who toiled under the hot Roman sun, working the long, narrow strips of land that stretched across the empire from one end to the other. They were the ones who cleared the land, planted the crops, and harvested the food that fed the empire. Their lives were brutal, short, and filled with pain. Then there were the household slaves. They were the cooks and cleaners and errand runners of Roman society. They woke up early, worked late, and often had to put up with the verbal and sometimes physical abuse of their masters. But those were just the common slaves. Rome also had specialized slaves like accountants and secretaries and even doctors and teachers. In fact, many of these slaves were captives taken from Greece or the East. They were educated, refined, and could speak several languages. Because of their skills, they were worth a lot of money. Finally, there were the most tragic categories of slaves, the gladiators and the entertainers. Gladiators were often captured enemies or criminals sentenced to death. They were forced to fight to the death for the amusement of the crowds. And if they weren't killed in the arena, they might end up as entertainers performing for the pleasure of their masters. Now, each type of slave had a market rate, meaning the price that a slave could be bought and sold for. The more unique or highly skilled a slave was, the higher his market rate. For example, a common farm laborer might only cost about 2,000 sesterces, but a Greek secretary who knew 5 languages could fetch as much as 40,000 sesterces. That's a pretty wide gap, especially considering that the average annual wage for a common Roman laborer was only about 1,000 sesterces. So we can see that not all slaves were equal in Roman society. Some were considered property, nothing more than tools to be used and discarded at will. Others were seen as valuable assets to be carefully managed and utilized. And it's this disparity that creates the strange paradox of slavery in ancient Rome. You see, the Romans invented an institution called familia, which designated a head of the household responsible for managing his family's affairs, both big and small. The head of the family, or paterfamilias, was the ultimate authority over his slaves. He could buy them, sell them, free them, or even kill them. But when it came to specialized slaves, the paterfamilias often delegated these duties to someone else in the family, such as an older son or a trusted freedman. That's because these slaves were not just property, they were investments. And like any investment, they needed to be carefully managed in order to turn a profit. For example, a wealthy Roman might purchase a young Greek slave boy for 40,000 sesterces. But instead of putting him to work in the fields or the mines, he would send him to school to learn Latin, Greek, and mathematics. After a few years of study, the slave would become a secretary or accountant and could earn his master a handsome profit. Of course, this was a risky investment. There was no guarantee that the slave would ever become a valuable asset. In fact, many slaves were too stupid or lazy to learn anything useful. But for the Romans, it was worth the risk because the potential rewards were just too great to pass up. On the other hand, common slaves like the ones who worked in the fields or as domestic servants were considered nothing more than tools. They were bought and sold like any other piece of property, and their lives were cheap and brutal. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for a slave to be beaten, tortured, or even killed simply for trying to escape. So we can see that the Romans did not treat all slaves equally. Those who were considered valuable were given special treatment, while the rest were treated like garbage. It's a sad reality, but it's an important one. Because slavery is not just a thing of the past. In fact, there are millions of slaves today who are bought and sold just like the common slaves of ancient Rome. If you want to know more about slavery in the Roman Empire, stay tuned for more videos. And as always, thanks for watching. Rome wasn't built in a day, but if you were born into the wrong family, you might not live to see its completion. Welcome back, everyone. I'm your host. And today we're exploring how Rome's elite showed off their wealth through their prized possessions. Now, if you've been following along, you know we've explored how the Roman Emperor Augustus used his vast wealth to build monuments to his glory and how the wealthy elite spent money on extravagant villas and clothing. But the emperors and elites weren't the only ones who could afford luxury items. In fact, even a middle-class Roman could own a slave or two to do the housework. Owning one or two slaves was no more scandalous than owning a pet. And some historians estimate that at least a third of Roman households, both rich and poor, had one or two slaves. But of course, when it came to luxury items, the ultra-rich took things to the extreme. Some of the wealthiest aristocrats in Rome owned hundreds or even thousands of slaves. These Romans dressed in fine clothes, ate delicious food, and drank the finest wine, all served to them by their many slaves. The rich enjoyed being waited on, hand and foot, and they expected their slaves to be well-trained and eager to please. A well-trained slave was a valuable asset, so the most expensive slaves were put to work as managers, cooks, craftsmen, and entertainers. Some slaves were educated and tutored, then put to work as secretaries, accountants, and even teachers. Their pay, if you will, consisted of room and board and whatever coin the master chose to give them. They rarely saw their earnings, and any extra money went directly to their master. And because masters could and frequently did beat their slaves without consequence, working conditions were also ripe for abuse. Slaves were considered property, not people. This meant that if a slave broke an expensive vase, their master could punish them by beating them with a whip or forcing them to work longer hours. And if a slave displeased their master in any other way, the same punishment awaited them. For the wealthy Romans, owning a large number of expensive slaves was a way to show off their status. It was common for the rich to acquire slaves from the spoils of war and to parade them around the city as proof of their wealth and power. Imagine a Roman emperor or senator striding through the streets with a group of exotic slaves following behind him, each one more attractive or better trained than the last. It was essentially the ancient Roman equivalent of showing off a sports car or a luxury yacht. Expensive, rare slaves were a sign of wealth and power, and they didn't come cheap. The cost of maintaining a large household staff of slaves is staggering. Even the cheapest slaves cost money up front and then had to be fed, clothed, and housed. Rebellious slaves also had to be watched. At any time, a slave could rise up against his or her master and take control of the household, which happened more often than you might expect. If a slave revolt was suspected, guards had to be hired to watch the slaves and make sure they didn't escape or plot. In fact, a famous slave revolt led by Spartacus, a gladiator, took place in the 1st century BCE. It lasted for years and involved tens of thousands of enslaved people. The revolt ended with the executions of captured rebels, including Spartacus, and a brutal crackdown on slaves throughout the empire. Still, for Rome's elite, the benefits outweighed the risks. Having expensive, exotic slaves was a way to flex their power in society. Now, not all slaves in ancient Rome were chained galley slaves working on ships or slaves chained to chariots whipping horses. Life for a slave in an aristocratic household wasn't all that bad. Food was plentiful, as were blankets and beds. Masters sometimes allowed their slaves to sleep in their own rooms, and occasionally slaves were given small jobs in the community so they could earn money and perhaps buy their freedom. It was rare, but not unheard of, for a slave to earn enough money to purchase freedom for themselves or for their children. Once a slave was freed, they were given the status of a freedman or a freed woman. Freedmen were generally treated better than regular slaves, but they still had to be careful not to upset their former master. Owning slaves in ancient Rome was a complicated issue, but they were definitely a luxury item. While even the middle class could own one or two, it was the emperors and the elite who took slave ownership to the extreme. They owned hundreds or even thousands of slaves who served them in every capacity. It wasn't always easy being a slave owner, but for Rome's elite, it was definitely worth it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that thumbs up button. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. So here's an interesting fact. In ancient Rome, you could rent a slave. Not exactly what you were expecting to hear today, are you? Well, stay with us because we're about to take you back to a time when human beings were considered nothing more than tools to make money. Welcome to my channel. And today let's find out how the Romans rented a human being. Now, the concept of slavery is something that has been around for thousands of years, dating back to ancient civilizations such as the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans. But it was during the days of the Roman Empire that slavery reached its peak. And no, we're not talking about the number of slaves, but the way they were perceived and treated. Strangely enough, Romans saw slaves less as humans and more as financial assets. A master could rent out his slaves for labor, much like leasing equipment. Gladiators, for example, were investments in entertainment. A talented fighter could generate huge profits in the arena. Trained athletes were rented out for chariot racing. And educated slaves were utilized to manage business transactions, acting as human accountants. Even concubines were valued for their beauty and ability to charm guests. In the eyes of the Romans, everyone had a price tag around their neck, including the ones who were born free. The value of a human life, therefore, was measured in denarii. For the wealthy Romans, it was not uncommon to treat slaves like property portfolios, some risky, some profitable, but all tied to money. Let us delve deeper into this concept by exploring different scenarios where slaves were considered nothing more than commodities. One such instance was the hiring of slaves for labor. In ancient Rome, many people owned slaves and rented them out for various tasks, such as construction work or farming. This meant that slaves were seen as tools to generate income, similar to how one might rent out machinery or equipment. The concept of renting a slave may seem shocking to us today, but it was commonplace in Roman society. They believed that since slaves were property, they could be bought, sold, and leased like any other possession. Renting slaves allowed owners to make money off their investments and acquire additional property. Moreover, it provided an opportunity for those who needed temporary assistance to complete a project to hire the necessary workforce. Another example of the Roman practice of treating slaves as financial assets was in the world of gladiators. Gladiator fights were a popular form of entertainment in ancient Rome, and highly skilled fighters could earn significant profits for their owners. Slave owners would invest in training gladiators to become proficient fighters and then rent them out to fight in the arenas. The most successful gladiators could generate substantial income for their owners, making them highly valuable assets. In fact, the value of a gladiator could increase with victories, just like a stock market investment. The potential for profit in the world of gladiatorial combat meant that slave owners were incentivized to treat their fighting slaves, while ensuring they received proper training and care. This ultimately led to the emergence of highly skilled and popular gladiators who could command top dollar in the rental market. So now you know why the Romans built Colosseum. It was not just for the entertainment of the masses. It was also a place where investors could showcase their prized possessions and make a hefty profit. Moving on, let's talk about educated slaves. In ancient Rome, some slaves were fortunate enough to receive an education, which made them highly valuable assets. These educated slaves were often put in charge of managing financial transactions for their owners. As a result, they were treated as financial assets rather than property. Their literacy and numeracy skills were put to use in managing accounts, making them essential for the economic well-being of their owners. The ability to read and write was a rare skill in those times, and those who possessed it, especially slaves, were highly sought after. Many merchants and businessmen owned slaves who acted as their personal secretaries, managing their correspondence and keeping track of their finances. Additionally, educated female slaves were often employed as managers in brothels, where they oversaw the operations and managed the finances of the establishment. As you can see, these examples demonstrate that in ancient Rome, slaves were often viewed as financial assets rather than human beings. The Romans believed that since they owned slaves, they could buy, sell, and lease them as they pleased. Whether used for labor, entertainment, or financial management, slaves were considered nothing more than commodities to be exploited for profit. And that's all for today, folks. We hope you enjoyed this journey through ancient Rome. If you want more videos like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Until next time, remember to stay curious. Rome wasn't built in a day, but if you want to build an empire, that kind of time scale is pretty helpful. In just 200 years, it went from a small village to a Mediterranean superpower. But behind the glittering wealth and the glorious art, there was a brutal truth. Most Roman slaves were captives from war or victims of piracy or raids. Whole populations could be enslaved, dragged into markets, and sold in bulk. Families were separated, children auctioned off without a moment's hesitation. The demand for slaves was simply insatiable, and the empire thrived on buying and selling human beings. In the 1st century, one Roman writer estimated that there were about 2 million slaves in the empire, maybe more. That's equivalent to around 10% of the entire population, a bigger proportion than in any other ancient society we know of. In some parts of the empire, such as Greece and Sicily, estimates suggest that 1 in 3 people were enslaved. For every philosopher who became a tutor in a Roman household, thousands toiled in the mines or died in harsh labor camps. And their suffering rarely made it into Rome's grand histories. For the average Roman, slaves were essential. They were indispensable to the economy, a source of cheap labor that helped produce food, clothes, furniture, jewelry, marble statues, everything that sustained the empire. For the slaves themselves, life was a constant struggle for survival, a desperate attempt to stay alive under the most dire circumstances. Let me tell you about a boy called Titus. He was born into slavery, the son of a woman who worked as a servant in a Roman household. As a kid, he would have been expected to help his mother with the housework, looking after the children, preparing food, cleaning clothes, taking care of animals, basically anything and everything his owner demanded. Life would have been tough, but not necessarily unusual for a Roman slave. We don't really know what happened to Titus when he was 12, but something terrible did. During a battle between the Romans and the Jews over in the province of Judea, Titus and his mother were captured and taken to a slave market in Rome. There they were put up for auction, separated, and sold to different owners. The boy ended up in the house of a senator who decided to take him on as his pupil, which sounds kind of nice until you realize that as a slave, Titus had no choice but to become the personal property of his new owner. Forced to live with him, travel with him, eat with him, sleep with him, literally follow him everywhere. He might have hoped to learn to read and write, but instead he became the senator's sex slave. We don't know how long this went on for or how it ended, but after a decade or so, Titus was freed and allowed to live the rest of his life as a free man. Whether or not he actually managed to escape his traumatic past is another matter entirely. You see, stories like Titus aren't exactly unique. They're pretty much par for the course for a Roman slave. And while there are tales of individual slaves escaping or revolting, for the most part they accepted their fate. The alternative was usually death. Historians estimate that around 30% of Roman slaves were born into slavery and the rest were captives. Being born into slavery wasn't necessarily a bad thing because at least you had a mom and a dad. A lot of the captives didn't. They were snatched as kids during one of Rome's many, many wars and raids and then adopted into local communities, a process that involved taking on the customs, language, and religion of your captors. Some captives were able to buy their freedom after a few years, but many weren't. Instead, they were passed down through generations until they or their descendants were finally set free. The most common stereotype of a Roman slave is someone working in a household. A kind of personal assistant, chef, waiter, gardener, handyman rolled into one. These slaves were generally higher on the rungs than others because they had regular access to food, clothing, even health care, but things could still get pretty brutal. Masters sometimes beat their slaves to death, throw them into the Tiber River if they got too stroppy or just for fun, or throw lavish parties where they invite 8 men of only one type, bald, short, or fat. I know all of this sounds pretty grim, and it is. But I also hope it gives you an idea of just how vast and complex the Roman Empire really was. I mean, think about it. If you lived in ancient Rome, you could spend your entire life there and never leave. You could visit every province, trade with merchants from the East, sail around the Mediterranean, fight in wars across Europe and North Africa. You could do all of that without ever leaving the empire. That's why it's so important to remember that Rome wasn't just about emperors and senators and orators making laws and giving speeches and having affairs. It was also about ordinary people going about their everyday lives, living, working, trying to make the best of things in a world that often seemed determined to keep them down. When we think of ancient Rome, we picture a world of emperors and gladiators, of aqueducts and arches, of triumphs and tyrannies. But behind these spectacles, beneath these stones, there's a story rarely told, the story of Roman slaves. Rome was built by slaves, and without them it couldn't have thrived. They were the backbone of the empire, working in mines and on farms and households and in construction. It's estimated that at its peak, Rome owned around 1,500,000 slaves, about a quarter of its entire population. But how much were these slaves worth? Well, the answer isn't simple. Roman slaves weren't commodities you bought off the shelf. Their value depended on a myriad of factors, from their age and sex to their skills and where they were purchased. Generally, the older and less skilled, the cheaper the slave. A young female slave, especially one from Greece or Asia Minor, could fetch a high price, sometimes as much as 2,000 sesterces, the ancient Roman currency. That's the equivalent of around 40,000 US dollars today. Skilled slaves like scribes or artisans could also earn their owners a lot of money and thus were quite expensive. On the other hand, a captured Gallic warrior, for instance, might be valued less due to the perceived coarseness of the Germanic people. The same goes for prisoners of war. Rome kept records of how much it spent on purchasing or freeing slaves. These figures are staggering, totaling up to 38 million sesterces in the 1st century AD in today's money. That's nearly $800 billion. So when we talk about the wealth invested in slaves, the numbers are truly mind-boggling. But these figures don't tell the whole story, because not all slaves were bought and sold. Many were born into slavery. And the system of slavery was so ingrained in Roman society that even the concept of manumission, the freeing of a slave, came at a cost. In fact, it was expensive to free a slave. The owner had to pay a set fee to the state, and this fee was actually quite high. To free a male or female slave in Rome cost around 3,000 sesterces, the equivalent of about $60,000. This high cost highlights the significant investment Romans made in the institution of slavery. Now, while it may seem like a generous sum to free a single slave, remember that this was the price for just one individual. And it was a price that many Roman slave owners were apparently willing to pay. Over the years, many slaves were freed, and some former slaves even went on to become wealthy and influential members of society. However, the cost of slavery went far beyond the monetary. It's impossible to put a price tag on the sorrow of families torn apart when people were stripped away as captives or born into bondage. You can't measure the despair of those who lived without hope of freedom, and there were rebellions too. Remember Spartacus, the gladiator who led the most significant slave revolt in Roman history. His rebellion, along with others like the Sicilian slave revolt, shook the foundations of the Roman world. These uprisings demonstrated the explosive potential of discontent among the enslaved, reminding us that dehumanizing another human being doesn't come without consequences. The truth is, Rome paid for its dependence on slavery in ways it didn't anticipate, not only in coins but in blood, fear, and unrest. In the end, while Roman slaves had clear financial costs, their true value can't be measured in coins. They built Rome's roads, harvested its food, educated its children, and entertained its masses. Without them, the Roman Empire wouldn't have functioned. But their labor built an empire, but it also built resentment, rebellion, and instability. So the next time you walk past a museum exhibit or see a movie about ancient Rome, take a moment to remember the unseen cost of the empire's grandeur. And let this be a lesson for our times, a reminder that no society is immune to the consequences of its choices. And if you enjoyed this episode, do check out our other videos, which bring history to life in engaging and accessible ways. Thank you for watching and learning with us.